There's a Canadian invasion on American politics. I have no idea why that. Well, that's a lie. I know why it is. It's because Canada is too sane for morons on the right, and so they come to the U.S. because they were essentially ostracized because they were so dumb that they have to revert to coming to the United States. That list is very long. Now, Crowder's Canadian, but he was born here, so I guess he doesn't count. But Roaming Millennial was born in Canada. Lauren Southern was born in Canada. Gavin McInnes was born in Canada. And there's an even lengthier list. You can add to it below. Those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head. But we looked at a Roaming Millennial video recently, and it was hilarious how dumb it was. She is legitimately the biggest airhead on the entire planet, and that is not in any way, shape, or form an exaggeration. Not even in the slightest. It simply isn't. It's just the truth. Her entire taxonomy is basically SJW bad. That's it. That's it. That's as far as her intellect, well, lack of intellect goes, I should say. She unironically said that the best time frame on YouTube was one in which all everyone talked about was SJW bad. I'm not trolling. She literally said that. She said that YouTube was at its best. Political YouTube was at its best when people were making video after video after video talking about these fringe groups of people on college campuses saying SJW bad, while real issues like 40,000 people dying every year because they have a basic lack of health insurance, or, the over $1 trillion of student loan debt that we have now, which is just ballooning all the time, and the supposed conservative problems. I mean, the deficit is being bloated. Don't hear anyone talking about that. They definitely don't want to talk about that, or else they'd be exposed as massive hypocrites. But she doesn't have any substance. She didn't talk about the issues. She's just a one-trick pony. I think that's the phrase. I hope I'm not messing up like Klay Thompson. But the point here being total, utter airhead, man. It's so terrible. So we're going to be looking at this video. She's going to be making the argumentation that people of color are not oppressed in the United States.
As it might be, hearing students complain about being oppressed at a liberal arts college in the United States, the sad fact of the matter is that these kids are probably just parroting what they've been told their entire lives. The idea that non-white people, or people of color, if you will, are being systematically marginalized by our society is a narrative that's been pushed by social justice advocates for decades. It's an idea that's been propagated by leftist academics, quote-unquote journalists, and especially increasingly in popular culture. As repugnant as I find the behavior of the Evergreen College students, it's really not all that surprising that they think the way they do, having grown up in this kind of environment. So in this video, in the hopes of healing this headache of imaginary oppression that is going around the social justice sphere, we're going to be talking all about oppression, what it means to be oppressed, and how in the United States and in the rest of the Western world, no, people of color, you are not oppressed. So to start, let's go over the definition of oppression. And yes, I know this is super basic, but after hearing those students protest, I really do feel that cracking a dictionary open is necessary. So the definition of oppression is really quite simply prolonged cruel or unjust treatment or control. Now with this definition, I think it is perfectly clear to say that in the past, people of color, and more specifically African American people, were oppressed by societies in the United States and the West in general. I'm not going to argue against that. However, the issue here is that these Evergreen students and so many social justice warriors out there are not just arguing for the idea of past oppression, but for current and ongoing oppression. And really, that is just a completely inaccurate analysis of the world that we live in. Obviously, in the United States, there are no legal rights that a white person possesses that a non-white person does not, and there are no laws on the books that reference an individual's race in any way, right? I mean, our legal system, our entire system of government is not one that is racially coded. And while, in my opinion, equal standing in the eyes of the law and equal standing before government is a pretty clear indication that oppression is not happening, some critics might say, no, what are you talking about? There's no equal standing. There are huge racial disparities when it comes to the legal system, especially the criminal justice system. Just look at how much more likely black people are to be incarcerated than Hispanic or white people. I mean, obviously that's the result of oppression. Okay, so to answer the question of oppression in relation to the criminal justice system, which comes up a lot, we first need to return to our definition of oppression. To repeat once more, oppression is prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control. So what this definition means for our discussion here is that black people being more likely to be incarcerated is not evidence in and of itself to prove that they are oppressed. Oppression refers specifically to unjust treatment or unjust punishment. So for oppression to be happening, black people would need to be incarcerated unjustly at a higher rate than other races, right? Because it wouldn't be oppression if these people were being justly arrested and prosecuted for crimes that they actually did commit. So while many social justice activists try to paint the large black prison populations in the US as evidence of oppression, the fact is that black people are more likely to commit crimes than other races. So with this being the case, it is not unjust and therefore not oppressive for the racial makeup of prison populations to be representative of the racial makeup of people who commit crimes. The question here isn't, are there proportionately more black people in prison than white people, because obviously that's the case. The question is why? Is it because prejudice causes more black people than white people to be convicted of crimes that they did not commit? Or is it because on average a black person is more likely to commit a crime than a white person and therefore more likely to go to jail for what they've done? Statistics would indicate the latter. If we take a look at the most dangerous cities in the United States, we see that in general the African American populations of these cities are much higher than the national average. And I'm not bringing this up to go all race realist on you guys, but regardless of who's being charged for these crimes, wrongfully or not, areas that have large or concentrated African American populations also tend to correlate very strongly with areas that have high rates of reported violent crimes. So perhaps our legal system isn't going around willy-nilly convicting innocent black people of crimes they didn't commit. Perhaps individuals who happen to be black are making bad choices for which they have to deal with the consequences. And of course, another thing that's often brought up when it comes to the alleged oppression of non-white people in the US is the fact that African American and Hispanic incomes are much lower than the average white income. Clearly this equals oppression. I mean, come on. But again, like the prison statistics, the wage gap statistics would only be indicative of oppression if they were the result of unjust treatment. Black people and Hispanic people on average earning less than white people would in no way mean there's oppression going on if it was just the result of their comparative lack of skills. And when you look at the average education levels of the different races, it seems like this is actually pretty much the case. And something that I'd like to mention, which really debunks the idea that non-white people in the US are oppressed, is the fact that there are non-white groups out there who on average do better than their white counterparts in terms of education and finances. And yes, felony charges too. So under the SJW narrative, would it be safe to say that black people are the most oppressed, then Hispanic people, then white people, and then maybe Asians aren't oppressed at all? Or maybe they have special Asian privilege? Of course, that's not the case. Look, there are real problems in the black community. There's issues with incarceration, there's issues with drug use, unemployment, poverty, lack of education, fatherlessness. All of those problems are absolutely real, but the thing is, when you make the conversation about oppression and marginalization, it's almost like an abdication of personal responsibility. You're implying that in order to fix this problem, it's the outside world and the system that needs to change instead of your behavior. And look, the system is by no means perfect, but I think as is displayed by the success of Asian Americans, I don't think it's this racist, awful thing that people make it out to be. The United States is a meritocracy and—
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
All right, so this is pretty hilarious because she thinks she's legitimately being some really smart person here when really she's the dumbest person. She's actually dumber than the SJWs because at least like the root of argumentation that the SJWs may be using. Now, I'm going to assume she's not straw manning, and I'm going to assume she's actually citing arguments made by said SJWs, but at least those SJWs are right on the point. Yes, oppression, as you just saw, I think it was like prolonged, like uncruel treatment. Yeah, black people definitely make that mark 100%. Are you kidding me? I mean, talk about, we already know all the subjugation they've faced. And really, their argument would be basically once the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act was passed, it was all good. It's all done now. Yeah, we won. That's it. It's over. No, that's not how it works. Now, the biggest issue here is she says what she's talking about here is systemic, okay? Now, the thing about systemic/institutional oppression is very different because she says in the video that there's no laws on the books that, take race into account or anything like that. She says that, it's not overt, so it doesn't exist. But you dummy, oh my God, this is so hilarious. She literally cracks open, she says it's good to crack open a dictionary to look at the definition of oppression. You should do that. You should crack open a dictionary. You should look at the definition of systemic/institutional racism. that is far different from, it's not even the same as overt racism. So what systemic and institutional means is that the institutions have biases that express racism. There are no laws on the books that do this, but through the process of the criminal justice system and other political institutions, there is an expression of racism through them. And that's 100% true. It's legitimately impossible to argue against. So I made an entire video breaking this down and offering all the evidence. You can go check that out for all the sources I'm talking about. But there are many, many, many pieces of evidence of this. So there are study after study after study, and this is because of the Booker report. And this is a really big thing that we need to change in our criminal justice system. There was a Supreme Court case. It's Booker v. something. I forgot what it was. But basically, it was a case that decided whether or not the Supreme Court decided whether or not federal judges or judges in general can have more leeway over their sentencing rather than adhering to stricter guidelines. So after this happened, I think they have, I forget how many years, I think it's every 4 years, they have a Booker report issued where they look at all of the differences in sentencing. And so study after study after study find that black people and white people, despite committing the same crime, actually black people are actually getting higher sentences for the same crime. That's because white people are more likely to be given more leeway than black people. It's also because they're more likely to be given a sentence that's not a mandatory. They might not be given a conviction of a mandatory minimum sentence that requires a mandatory minimum sentence. There's also other forms of institutional racism through the executive branch, which is the police. The police are more likely to charge a black person with a charge that requires a mandatory minimum sentence rather than one that doesn't. And this is proven with study after study after study. These are facts. These are not, I hate to say this, but it's not feelings, but it's facts. There's no way to argue against this. These are just what happens every time there's a study done on this. Again, you can go check out my video on that. I put out all of the sources. I examine them, I look at them, and I show them. Additionally, there are other instances of this. Another example being, marijuana arrests. So despite black people and white people using marijuana virtually at the same rates, almost at the same rates pretty much every year, there are 8 black people are like 8 times more actually arrested for it. So this has nothing to do with whether or not, it was unjust or not. There's a bias in the criminal justice system in which black people are being overrepresented because despite white people doing it at the same rates, smoking marijuana at the same rates, they are for some reason getting off and not being arrested for marijuana crimes. So how can you have black people and white people doing it at the same rates, virtually the same rates, but black people, the overwhelming amounts are black people? It's ridiculous. It's very obvious. And here's something interesting too, is that even after marijuana got legalized, I forget where it was, but there's still actually disproportionate amount of black people being arrested. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. Now, more on that is it gets even worse. Our society is pretty racist, subtly speaking. So there are studies that come out which show that if you have a more black sounding name, like I don't know what they used as the typical ones, but if you have a more black sounding name, you're actually less likely to get a callback from an employer when you apply in comparison to a white person who has either the same or slightly lower merit or credentials to what they're applying for, that's absolutely insane, dude. That's insane. Now, there's also an even bigger problem, this is like the biggest overarching problem, which is that public schools are funded by local taxes. And African American are disproportionately affected by poverty because of the long history of subjugation that they've gone through. And so generational wealth is a huge indicator of how someone's going to succeed or not succeed in life. And so through unfair housing policies where black people were unable to get fair housing, and they were so their generational wealth was completely nuked and neutered. And you're also talking about the local taxes thing. So they are disproportionately, and all throughout history, they have been subjugated. And so the local tax numbers that actually come in are lower. And so if you're black, you're more likely to be in a poorer neighborhood because of your history. And that's undeniable. There's no way you can make the argument that white people and black people as a whole would be in the same, that they could be in the same situation, or that white people would succeed as much as black people do, assuming white people were enslaved for hundreds of years, and assuming that they were subjugated to Jim Crow laws for decades, and there's still voting suppression going on to this day, and that black names are more likely to get no calls despite having the same same credentials, or disproportionate amount of black arrests for marijuana possession, or everything else, right? Getting heavier sentences just because you're black. So there's no way you could tell me that. And then her evidence for, I guess, the contrary to this, what I'm saying is that, Asians make more money. Yeah, dude. But this has been debunked so bad, it's hilarious how bad this point is. So anytime you don't share a border with the country, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have an overrepresentation of rich people and more better off people in your nation. So what do I mean by that? So if you're not a border nation, how do you get to America if you're not at least well off, like decently? You have to already be well off in the first place to come here. So it's not that the Asian community in the United States from back in the day, went from being the lower tiers to all of a sudden they're super high in terms of, wealth. That's not what happened. What happened is you have those group of people, and then a shit ton of people from Asian countries came, because you have to have good amount of money to come all the way from fucking Asia, and you have to learn the language and all that different stuff. And to know English, you'll have to already know English. You'll have to have higher, education, which is more expensive. So that idea is not true. You're just having an overrepresentation of Asian people who are already well off. So it's not as if the Asian people in the United States started blooming. No, that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. And I think the worst point in the worst point in the video is that the United States is a meritocracy. If the United States was a meritocracy, your channel would have 0 subscribers, because you're dumb as shit and you don't fucking know anything. You don't know the definition of institutional or systemic racism because you're dumb as fuck. Yeah, I think Canada didn't want you because you were that fucking stupid, and you're just a total airhead. You're just a total airhead. You are legitimately dumber than Dave Rubin. You are a mini Dave Rubin. That's what you are. You are Dave Rubin light. You aspire to be Dave Rubin, but it won't happen for whatever reason that may be. But you are genuinely dumber than Dave Rubin, and there's just simply no way around it. And honestly, can't believe how fucking dumb this person is.